Hello, friends. We want to know from which cities you listen to us. Like and write in the comments where you are from. And also share what shocking stories happened in your city or even to you. Subscribe, because the next story may be about your city or your personal drama. And now, a new exciting story. Mom, did you get the yogurt? Sophie stood in the kitchen doorway, hands on her hips, her dark curls pulled back into a high ponytail, her voice filled with the usual teenage irritation. Allison stood at the stove, stirring the sauce. She turned to her daughter, wiping her hands on her apron. Sorry, Sophie, I forgot. I'll buy it tomorrow. You always forget. Sophie rolled her eyes and walked away, slamming the refrigerator door. Allison sighed, turning back to her cooking. She was 42, but she looked younger, slim, with neatly coiffed dark hair and light makeup. She worked as a senior marketer at a tech company, raised a daughter, and lived in a comfortable house in the Seattle suburbs. Her life seemed perfect, but in recent months Allison had felt an emptiness growing inside her. Everything was too right, too boringly predictable. David, her husband, walked into the kitchen holding the phone. He was 45, tall, with short brown hair and a calm gaze. As a software engineer, he spent his days coding and his evenings at home with his family. It smells good, he said, kissing Allison on the cheek. How's your day? Lots of meetings, she replied, cutting up a salad. We've launched a new project. And you? Everything is stable, David smiled. Sophie talking about yogurt again. Yeah, Allison shrugged. She's right, I did forget. David nodded, sitting down at the table. He was an attentive husband. He helped with chores, remembered anniversaries, never raised his voice. But his calm, his routine, all of it was starting to irritate her. Allison wanted something new, but she couldn't figure out what. Dinner is in 10 minutes, she said, placing the salad on the table. Great, I'll call Sophie. David stood up and headed for the stairs. Allison watched him go. Marriage, a daughter, a home, a stable job, everything she had dreamed of at 25. But now, standing in this kitchen, she felt trapped in a cage of her own making. In the morning, Allison sat in her office in downtown Seattle. Her team was preparing an advertising campaign for a new product, and she coordinated the work of designers and analysts. Work was the only place where Allison felt needed. Here, she was not just a wife or a mother, but a professional. Allison, have you seen the reports? Matt Riley walked into her office without knocking. He was 38, a sales manager, tall, with a shaggy blonde fringe and a charming smile. His shirt was always slightly wrinkled, and his tone was too casual for the office. Yeah, the numbers are good, Allison replied, looking away from the monitor. Did you charm everyone at the meeting again? Well, someone has to, Matt chuckled, sitting on the edge of her desk. Look, you're being too serious. Let's go for coffee after work. The team's getting ready. Allison hesitated. She rarely went out with her colleagues, always in a hurry to get home. But today, something in Matt's voice, his slight smile, made her think. I don't know, I'm busy, she said, fiddling with her pen. What's up? Dinner can wait. Matt leaned closer. Come on, Allison, just a coffee. She looked at him. His eyes were bright, full of energy that she so lacked. Okay, she said, one coffee. Matt's smile widened. Agreed. At 5 at the Starbucks on the corner. The day passed quickly at the office. Allison led a meeting with analysts, checked mock-ups, and answered emails. But her thoughts kept returning to Matt. He was not like David, too lively, too unpredictable. She knew he was not the type to be serious. The office whispered that Matt liked to party and rarely stayed with one woman for long. But that was precisely what drew her to him, his freedom, his ease. At 4 o'clock, she sent David a message. I'll be late at work, meeting with the team. Don't wait for dinner. David replied a minute later. Okay, no problem. Sophie is at Hannah's. I'll order pizza. Allison looked at the screen. His answer was the same as always, short, calm, no questions. She put the phone away and went to the bathroom to touch up her makeup. Looking in the mirror, she added a little lipstick and let her hair down. This wasn't for Matt, she told herself. Just for herself. Starbucks was noisy. Allison sat at a table with Matt and two colleagues, Sarah from design and Kevin from analytics. They discussed work, clients, and the latest gossip. Allison laughed at Matt's jokes, feeling the tension of the day melt away. Allison, have you ever been to Mexico? Matt asked, sipping his coffee. No, she answered. We were always going to be with David, but either work or Sophie. You shouldn't, Matt said. They have such parties there. I almost stayed in Cancun last year. Sarah laughed. Matt, you'll find a party everywhere. What's wrong with that? He looked at Allison. You only have one life. You have to make the most of it. Allison smiled, but his words hurt her. She took nothing from life except her responsibilities. Work, home, family, all of it was important. But where was she? Kevin and Sarah left an hour later, citing business. Allison stayed with Matt. They ordered more coffee, and the conversation became more personal. Are you always this proper? Matt asked, leaning back in his chair. Is it noticeable? Allison raised an eyebrow. You bet. It's like you're afraid to take a step to the side. She wanted to object, but fell silent. He was right. Her life was clearly scheduled. Morning, work, dinner, sleep. Even her dreams boiled down to a vacation once a year. Maybe I'm just used to it, she said quietly. Matt leaned closer. Habit is a trap. Sometimes you just have to take a risk. His voice was low, almost intimate. Allison felt a warmth in her chest. She knew she should leave, but instead she said, And what do you suggest? He smiled, but didn't answer. Instead, he changed the subject, telling her about his latest mountain hike. Allison listened, but her mind was elsewhere. Matt was dangerous not because of what he did, but because he made her want more. She returned home at 9 in the evening. David was watching TV in the living room. How was the meeting? He asked, without looking up from the screen. Okay, Allison replied, taking off her coat. We were discussing the project. Cool, David said. There's pizza in the fridge if you want it. She nodded and went upstairs. Sophie was in her room, the door closed. Allison knocked. Sophie, I'm home. Yeah, came from behind the door. Allison walked into the bedroom and lay down on the bed, fully dressed. She stared at the ceiling, remembering the evening. Matt, his smile, his words. It was just coffee, but she felt alive for the first time in months. The next day, Matt wrote to her in the work chat. The coffee was great. Let's do it again. Allison replied, Maybe. But she knew it wasn't a maybe. It was a yes, and that scared her as much as it excited her. At work, Matt began to come into her office more often. He brought her coffee, joked, and told stories. Allison noticed the way his eyes lingered, the way he casually touched her hand when he passed her papers. She didn't stop him. She liked the attention, the thrill, which she hadn't felt with David in years. One day, after another meeting, Matt lingered in her office. Allison, have you ever thought you could live differently? He asked, closing the door. What do you mean? She put the laptop down. I don't know. Without all this routine. Just for myself. Her heart began to beat faster. She wanted to say that she was happy with her life, but instead she asked, Do you live like this? I'll try, he smiled, and it wouldn't hurt you either. He stepped closer and Allison didn't back away. They stood in silence until he said, Let's go to dinner tomorrow. Just you and me. It wasn't a question. Allison knew she had to say no. She had a husband, a daughter, a life she couldn't just throw away. But she nodded. Okay, she said. Matt smiled and walked away. Allison sat in the Olive Garden restaurant, fiddling with her napkin. Across from her, Matt Riley studied the menu, his blonde hair falling slightly over his forehead. It was their first dinner together, and Allison could feel her palms sweating. She had told David she would be late at work because of an urgent project. The lie came easy, and it scared her. What are you taking? Matt asked, looking up. His smile was relaxed, as if they did this every night. Probably pasta, Allison replied, trying to sound calm. What about you? Steak. And wine, he winked. We have to celebrate. Mark what? She raised an eyebrow. Our escape from the routine. Matt put the menu down. You don't do that often, do you? Allison shook her head. She was 42, with 15 years of marriage, a daughter, and a house outside Seattle. Dinner with a coworker at a restaurant wasn't part of her normal routine. But Matt, with his energy and ease, made her feel alive. Not often, she admitted. I have a lot to do at home. I understand, Matt said, but there was no sympathy in his voice. But sometimes you just have to do something for yourself. The waiter came over and Matt ordered a bottle of red wine. Allison wanted to protest she rarely drank, but she kept quiet. When the wine arrived, Matt raised his glass. For you, Allison, for being here. She smiled, clinked her glasses with him, and took a sip. The wine was tart, and she felt a slight warmth in her chest. The conversation flowed easily. Matt talked about his trip to Colorado, about how he almost fell off a cliff during a hike. Allison laughed, forgetting about the time. But then her phone vibrated. A text from David. Are you coming soon? Sophie asked. Allison quickly wrote, Another hour, project is running late. She put her phone away, but a pang of guilt stabbed her. Matt noticed her tension. Is everything okay? He asked, leaning closer. Yeah, just things to do. She waved it off. Family. Matt nodded, but didn't press the issue. Instead, he steered the conversation toward work, toward a new project their team was launching. Allison was grateful for the change of subject. She didn't want to think about David or Sophie. Not right now. Dinner ended around 9. Matt insisted that they walk to her car. It was chilly outside, and Allison pulled her coat tighter around her. Matt walked beside her, his hand occasionally brushing her elbow. That was fun, he said, stopping by her car. We should do it again. Allison looked at him. His eyes glittered in the lantern light, and she felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't just dinner. She knew where this was going, and yet she didn't want to stop. Yes, we must, she answered quietly. Matt stepped closer, and for a second she thought he was going to kiss her. But he just smiled and said, Good night, Allison. She got into her car, her heart pounding. On the way home, she tried to tell herself it was nothing. Just dinner, just a coworker. But deep down, she knew she had crossed a line. The house was quiet. David was sitting in the living room, reading something on his tablet. He looked up when Allison walked in. It took a long time, he said, but without reproach. Did everything go well? Yes, Allison took off her coat, avoiding his gaze. A lot of work. Sophie's already asleep, David added. She's been kind of off today. Allison nodded, feeling a twinge of guilt. She didn't ask what was wrong with Sophie. Instead, she said, I'm tired. I'll go to bed. David looked at her, but said nothing. Allison went up to the bedroom, closed the door, and lay down on the bed. She looked at the ceiling, remembering the evening. Matt, his smile, his words. It was wrong, but she couldn't stop thinking about him. The next day at the office, Matt was acting like he always did, joking with his colleagues, giving out instructions. But when they were alone in the conference room, he closed the door and said, You were great yesterday. Relaxed. It suits you. Allison felt her cheeks burn. Thank you, she replied, fiddling with her pen. But Matt, we have to be careful. Oh, I'm a master of discretion, he chuckled. No one will know. His confidence was both reassuring and frightening. Allison wanted to argue, but nodded instead. They went back to discussing the project, but her mind was elsewhere. Matt was like a breath of air after being underwater for so long. She didn't want to lose that feeling. Over the next few weeks, their romance grew. They corresponded via work chat, but the messages became increasingly personal. Matt would write, Are you wearing a blue dress today? You look hot. Allison would reply, You always say that. She knew it was dangerous, but every compliment he gave her made her feel wanted. They met after work. Coffee, dinner, sometimes walks. Matt never pressed, but his hints became bolder. One Friday, he suggested going to his place. Allison declined, citing work, but the thought wouldn't leave her. She imagined what it might be like and then immediately pushed those thoughts away. At home, she tried to act normal, but her mind was elsewhere. David was cooking dinner, Sophie was doing her homework, and Allison felt like a stranger in her own home. She justified herself. She wasn't doing anything wrong, she was just hanging out with a coworker. Her marriage wasn't perfect, she deserved some space. But every time David looked at her or Sophie asked for something, the guilt returned. One evening, Sophie walked into the kitchen where Allison was checking her phone. "Mom, are you even listening to me?" Sophie crossed her arms. She was 18, preparing to go to college, and her patience with her mother was clearly waning. "Of course I'm listening." Allison put the phone away. "What were you saying?" "I asked about the trip to the university. You promised to go with me to the open day," Sophie frowned, "but you seem to be busy with something else." Allison winced. "Sorry, Sophie. Of course, we'll go. When?" "Next Saturday." Sophie looked at her suspiciously. "You've been acting weird lately. Is everything okay?" "It's okay," Allison forced a smile. "Just work." Sophie nodded, but her eyes were distrustful. She went into her room, and Allison remained in the kitchen, clutching her phone. She knew Sophie was right. She was pulling away from her daughter, from her husband, from everything that had once been important. At the office, the affair with Matt became increasingly difficult to hide. They tried not to cross paths too often, but their glances and occasional touches gave them away. One day, Sarah, a colleague, a designer, said at lunch, "Allison, you're glowing. New face cream." Allison laughed, but her heart sank. "That too, but mostly I just get enough sleep," she answered, hoping she sounded convincing. Matt, sitting next to her, said nothing, but his smile said it all. Allison knew they were playing with fire. If anyone in the office found out, it could cost her career. But she couldn't stop. Matt was her escape from the routine, her chance to feel young again. One evening, they were staying late at the office. Everyone had already left, and Matt suggested they have coffee in the break room. They were sitting on the couch, and he suddenly took her hand. "Allison, you do realize this is not just for fun, right?" he said quietly. She looked at him. His face was serious, without the usual mockery. "I understand," she replied, "but I don't know what to do." "Don't do anything," he squeezed her hand. "Just live." Allison started to protest, but he leaned down and kissed her. It was their first kiss, brief but full of promise. She pulled away, feeling her cheeks burn. "We can't," she said, but her voice trembled. "No one will know," Matt smiled. "I promise." She nodded, even though she knew it was a lie. They both knew. At home, Allison avoided David. She cooked dinner, talked to Sophie, but her thoughts were on Matt. David, as always, was calm, but one day at dinner he said, "You seem distant, Allison. Did something happen?" She froze, holding her fork. "No, I'm just tired," she answered without looking at him. "A lot of work." David nodded, but his gaze lingered on her. Allison felt her heart tighten. She loved David, but his predictability, his kindness, no longer touched her. She wanted passion, risk, what Matt gave her. Sophie, who was sitting opposite, suddenly said, "Mom, are you even with us? You're not even eating." Allison forced a smile. Sophie, just thinking." Sophie snorted and walked away from the table. Allison looked at her empty plate, feeling the guilt become unbearable. She was ruining not only her marriage, but her relationship with her daughter. But the thought of ending things with Matt was even worse. That night, she lay awake, listening to David's steady breathing. Her phone blinked a text from Matt. "Miss you. See you tomorrow?" Allison replied, "Yes." "Allison, you were late last night," David said, folding the newspaper on the dining room table. He looked at her over his glasses, his voice even but slightly strained. Allison, pouring coffee into a thermos, answered without turning around. "Yes, I had to deal with the reports. New client, everything urgent." "You've been staying late a lot," David noted, tapping his fingers on the table. Is this every night now? She turned, forcing a smile. She was 42, made to look younger by regular jogging and careful makeup, but she felt like a target. Not everyone, she said. It's just the peak of the project now. It will get easier soon. David nodded, but his eyes never left hers. He was a software engineer, used to analyzing details, and Allison knew he noticed more than he said. She quickly changed the subject. Has Sophie gone to school yet? Yes, by bus, David answered. She asked me to remind her about the open day at the university. Are you going with her? Sure, Allison nodded, although she'd almost forgotten about it. Saturday, right? Yes, David stood up, putting the newspaper away. I'm going to work. I'll see you tonight. He left, and Allison remained in the kitchen, clutching the thermos. Her heart was beating faster than it should. David wasn't accusing, he wasn't asking directly, but his questions weren't just curiosity. She knew he was starting to suspect something. At the office, Allison was deep in a presentation for a new client. Her team was preparing an advertising campaign, and as a senior marketer, she was responsible for the final version. Work was her sanctuary, a place where she could take her mind off David, Sophie, and Matt. Matt Riley walked in on her before lunch, holding 2 cups of coffee. He was 38, a sales manager with tousled blonde hair and a smile that was disarming. For you, he said, placing the glass on her table. Soy, no sugar, right? Thank you. Allison took the coffee, trying not to meet his eyes. Don't you have anything else to do? Yes, but you're more interesting. Matt sat down opposite. How are you? You look tense. She shrugged, opening a file on her laptop. There's just a lot of work. And at home, everything's complicated. Matt leaned closer, lowering his voice. Is it difficult because of me? Allison looked at him. His tone was light, but his eyes were serious. Their affair had begun 2 months ago, coffee, dinners, kisses in an empty office. She knew it was dangerous, but she couldn't stop. Not only, she replied, David, he asks questions. What do you tell him? Matt leaned back in his chair. That I'm late because of work. Allison looked away. But he's not stupid. Matt nodded, tapping the table thoughtfully. Maybe it's time to stop lying, to leave him, to start from scratch. Allison froze. She expected a lot from Matt, but not this. Leave? She asked again. Are you serious? Why not? Matt shrugged. You're unhappy, it's obvious. Why hold on to something that's suffocating you? She shook her head, feeling her throat tighten. I have a daughter, Matt, a house, a marriage. I can't just give up and give it all up. You can if you want, he said, looking into her eyes. I'm not saying it will be easy, but you deserve to live for yourself. Allison was silent. The thought of leaving David was terrifying, but deep down she knew Matt was right. She was unhappy. But leaving her family for a man who liked to party and didn't promise anything serious, that was crazy. I don't know, she finally said. I need time. Matt nodded without pressing. Okay, but think about it. I don't want to be just your hobby. He left, and Allison was left in the office, staring at the screen. Her thoughts were in a tangle. She wanted Matt, but she wasn't ready to lose everything else. That evening, Allison came home earlier than usual, determined to spend time with Sophie. She had promised to help with her college essay, and this was a chance to connect with her daughter. Sophie was sitting in the living room, staring at her laptop. She was 18, studying for college, and her mood had been volatile lately. Hey, Allison sat down next to her, putting her bag on the floor. How was the essay? Sophie shrugged, not looking up from the screen. Fine. Almost finished. Want to see it? Allison offered, trying to sound interested. No need. Sophie finally looked at her. You're busy. Allison winced. There was more to her daughter's voice than just teenage sarcasm. There was something else, something hurt. I'm not busy, she said. I want to help. Sophie closed her laptop and crossed her arms. You're always somewhere, Mom. Either work or something else. I'm not stupid, you know. Allison felt her cheeks burn. Sophie, I really do work a lot. This is temporary. Yeah, right. Sophie stood up. Okay, I'll finish writing it at the top. She walked away, leaving Allison in the living room. Allison clenched her fists, fighting the urge to run after her. Sophie could see her distance, and it was worse than David's questions. She wanted to fix this, but she didn't know how. Later, at dinner, David was quieter than usual. They ate the baked fish he had prepared, and Allison tried to fill the silence. "How are things at work?" she asked, cutting potatoes. "Fine," David replied without looking up. "We've launched a new project." "Cool," Allison nodded, although she wasn't listening. Her thoughts were preoccupied with her conversation with Matt. David suddenly put down his fork. "Allison, are you okay? You seem kind of not here." She forced herself to look at him. "It's okay," she said. "I'm just tired." "You're always tired," he noted. "Or is it not tiredness?" Her heart skipped a beat. She wanted to brush it off, but his gaze was too direct. "David, I'm really just busy," she said, trying to sound convincing. "It'll be okay soon." He nodded, but didn't look convinced. The rest of the dinner passed in silence. Allison felt her lie growing heavier. The next day at the office, Matt was more reserved. He didn't come to see her, but he sent her a message. "Think about what I said. I'm serious." Allison didn't answer. She was trying to focus on her work, but Matt's words were spinning in her head. Leaving David, it would mean breaking up the family, losing Sophie, being the one who gave up everything for her lover. But staying in a marriage she no longer enjoyed was no easier. At lunchtime, she met her friend Carol at a cafe near the office. Carol, the owner of the coffee shop, was 2 years younger than Allison and always spoke plainly. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," Carol said, taking a bite of her sandwich. "What's going on?" Allison wanted to laugh it off, but instead she admitted, "I'm confused. Work, home, everything is pressing." "Yeah, what else?" Carol narrowed her eyes. "You look like you're in love." Allison froze, but quickly shook her head. "No, nothing like that. Just stress." Carol didn't believe it, but she didn't press. "If anything happens, you know where to find me," she said. "But be careful. You're not one to take the consequences lightly." Allison nodded, feeling her throat tighten. Carol was right, she wasn't good at dealing with the aftermath. But she couldn't stop. That evening, Matt was waiting for her in the break room after work. The office was empty, and he closed the door as soon as she entered. "Have you thought about it?" he asked, crossing his arms. Allison sighed, placing her bag on the table. "Matt, I can't just get up and leave. I have a daughter, a home, a life." "A life in which you are unhappy," he countered. "I see how you glow when we are together. It is not just like that." She looked at him. His confidence was infectious, but frightening. "And then what?" she asked. "You're not one to settle down. What happens in a year?" Matt shrugged. "I don't know. But does it matter? The main thing is now." Allison shook her head. "It is important to me. I can't risk everything for now." He stepped closer and took her hand. "Then let's just enjoy it while we can. No promises, no plans, just you and me." She wanted to refuse, but his touch, his voice, all of it pulled her back. She nodded, and he kissed her, longer this time than before. When they pulled away, Allison knew she was making a mistake, but she couldn't stop herself. At home, David was in the living room watching the news. Allison walked in, trying to look natural. "Hello," she said, taking off her coat. "Is Sophie home?" "At Hannah's," David replied, not looking up from the screen. "You're late again." "Yes, the meeting dragged on," she lied, feeling her voice tremble. David turned to face her. "Allison, if something's wrong, tell me. I don't want to guess." Her heart sank. She wanted to confess, but instead she said, "It's all right, David, right?" He nodded, but his eyes said he didn't believe her. Allison went upstairs, closed the bedroom door, and lay down on the bed. Her phone blinked a text from Matt. Tomorrow at 7, same bar, she answered, yes. She closed her eyes and realized that her lies were becoming her new normal. Allison, are you late again? David stood in the living room doorway, holding the TV remote. His voice was calm, but his eyes were irritated. Allison turned to face him as she pulled on her coat. She was 42 and looked younger thanks to her grooming, but she felt trapped. Yes, a meeting with a client, she replied, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. I'll be back by 9. David nodded, but his lips tightened. He knew how the workflow worked. Constantly staying late into the evening, especially for a marketer, was not normal. Meetings every night, he asked, squinting. Is that how it's going to be from now on? Not everyone, Allison tried to sound confident. It's just an important project. It'll be over soon. He said nothing, but his silence spoke louder than words. Allison walked out quickly, feeling her pulse quicken. She knew her excuses were becoming less and less convincing. At the Riverside bar, Matt Riley was waiting for her at a corner table. Today, he ordered a whiskey and a glass of white wine for Allison. You're late, he said, smiling. I thought you'd run away. Almost, Allison sat up, sipping her wine. David was asking where I was again. Matt shrugged, his smile unwavering. Tell the truth. Maybe it's time. Time? She looked at him. Are you kidding? I can't just tell him everything. Why? Matt leaned closer. You're not happy with him. That's obvious. Allison looked away. Their affair had lasted 3 months' dinners, kisses, secret meetings after work. Matt was her escape from the routine, but his offer to leave David sounded like a leap into the abyss. I have a daughter, Matt, she said quietly. Sophie, I can't let her down. Sophie's grown up, he countered. She'll cope, and you deserve to live for yourself. Allison shook her head. Matt didn't understand what it meant to be a parent, to be a wife. He lived an easy, no-strings-attached life, and that both attracted and scared her. Let's not talk about it, she said. Let's just be together. Matt nodded, but his eyes said the conversation wasn't over. They talked for another hour, laughing, discussing work. But when Allison got home, the guilt returned with renewed vigor. David was sitting in the living room, scrolling through his laptop. Sophie, their 18-year-old daughter, was already asleep upstairs. Allison quietly took off her coat, hoping to slip into the bedroom. You're back, David said without looking up. Did the meeting go well? Yes, she answered, trying not to meet his gaze. Everything's decided. Very well. His voice was cold. I'm going to bed. Good night. He closed his laptop and went upstairs. Allison stood in the hallway, feeling her throat tighten. David was no fool. He knew her delays weren't just work. That night, she lay awake, listening to David's steady breathing. Her phone was on the nightstand, the screen dark. She considered texting Matt, but decided against it. Instead, she closed her eyes, trying to convince herself that she had it all under control. David woke at 3 in the morning. Allison was asleep next to him, her breathing quiet. He looked at her for a few seconds, then looked at her phone. His suspicions had been growing for the past few weeks. Her delays, her distance, her evasive answers, all of it suggested she was hiding something. He didn't want to be paranoid, but he couldn't ignore the facts any longer. He carefully took her phone. Allison hadn't set a password. She'd always said they had nothing to hide from each other. David opened the messaging app and scrolled through the chats. His heart sank when he saw a name, Matt Riley, a name Allison had mentioned a couple of times, calling him a coworker. He opened the correspondence. The messages were short, but their content struck him like lightning. Matt, today at 7, same bar. Allison, yes, I'll try. Matt, you're cool when you're not thinking about work. Allison, you always say that. There were dozens of messages beyond that about meetings, compliments, hints. David scrolled further, feeling his chest tighten. One message from last week made him pause. Matt, think about it. Maybe it's time to leave. I'm serious. Allison, I don't know. It's complicated. He put the phone back. David lay down, staring at the ceiling. He felt no anger, only emptiness. The marriage, the daughter, the home, everything he had built was in jeopardy because of her affair with a coworker. In the morning, David behaved as usual. He made coffee, woke Sophie, and got ready for work. Allison noticed that he barely spoke, but attributed it to fatigue. "Are you okay?" she asked, pouring herself some coffee. "Yes," he answered without looking at her. "I just didn't get enough sleep." She nodded, but his coldness made her wary. Sophie went down to the kitchen, grabbed some toast, and ran out, muttering something about a bus. Allison wanted to talk to David, but he had already gone into the garage. At the office, she tried to concentrate on the presentation, but her thoughts kept returning to David. His silence was unusual. Matt came to her at lunch, holding a sandwich. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, sitting up. "It's like you're not here." "Nothing," Allison shook her head. "It's just tense at home." "Because of him?" Matt nodded, as if he knew the answer. "I told you, it's time to decide." "Don't start," she waved her hand. "I need time." Matt shrugged, but his gaze was insistent. "Time doesn't solve problems, Allison. You either choose or lose everything." She didn't answer, and he left. Allison stayed in the office, feeling her world crumbling. She wanted to save both her family and Matt, but she knew it was impossible. That evening, David was home, cooking dinner. Sophie was sitting at the table, scrolling through her phone. Allison walked in, trying to look natural. "Hi," she said, putting her bag down. "It smells delicious." David nodded without turning around. "Lasagna will be ready in 10 minutes. Allison wanted to ask what was wrong with him, but Sophie interrupted. "Mom, are you coming with me on Saturday? To the open day?" "Yes, of course," Allison smiled, but her voice was strained. Sophie rolled her eyes and went upstairs. Allison turned to David. "David, is something wrong? You've been silent all day." He stopped, holding the pan, his face stony. "Nothing," he said. "Just busy." "Are you sure?" She stepped closer. "If something happened, tell me." He looked at her, and there was something new in his eyes, pain mixed with cold. "I said everything's fine," he repeated, turning away. Allison felt her stomach clench. She knew he was lying. Dinner passed in silence. Sophie chatted about school, but David answered in monosyllables, and Allison barely touched her food. Later, after Sophie had gone to her room, Allison found David in his office. He was sitting at his desk, looking at the monitor. "David, we need to talk," she said, closing the door. "I can see you're angry. What happened?" He turned to face her, his gaze heavy. "I'm not angry," he said quietly. "I just don't care." "What does this mean?" Her voice trembled. "If I did something wrong, tell me." He shook his head as he stood up. "I don't want to talk, Allison. Not now." "David, please." She grabbed his hand. "I don't understand what's going on." He looked at her hand, then into her eyes. "You understand perfectly well," he said, and went out, leaving her alone. Allison stood in the middle of the office, her heart pounding. He knew. She wasn't sure how or what, but his words, his look, everything said it. She wanted to run after him, to explain that it was a mistake, that she loved him. But instead, she sat down in the chair, tears stinging her eyes. That night, David slept on the couch in the living room. Allison lay in their bedroom, staring into the darkness. She opened her phone, wanted to text Matt, but decided against it. Instead, she scrolled through their messages, each one like a knife. She knew she should stop, but the thought of losing Matt was unbearable. The next day, David acted as if nothing had happened. He talked to Sophie, cooked breakfast, but only spoke to Allison by phone necessity. "I'm picking Sophie up from school," he said as he left for work. "Will you be home?" "Yes," she answered, but he had already closed the door. Allison was left in an empty house, feeling like her life was falling apart. She wanted to fix it, but she didn't know how. Allison sat in her car in the office parking lot, gripping the steering wheel. Her phone was silent, no messages from Matt, no calls from David. Ever since David had found their messages 3 days ago, the house had become a silent zone. He only talked to her about Sophie or the mundane, avoiding any personal topics. Allison felt like her marriage was hanging by a thread, but work was her last refuge. She took a deep breath and got out of the car, hoping the rhythm of the office would distract her from her thoughts. The office was business as usual. The buzz of voices, the ringing of phones, the smell of coffee from the break room. Allison, a senior marketer, was about to present the final version of an advertising campaign at a morning meeting. She had her laptop open, checking her slides, when Sarah, a designer on her team, walked into her office. Sarah, a short woman with short red hair, looked awkward. "Allison, can I talk?" she asked, closing the door. "Sure." Allison put her laptop down. "Something with the layouts?" Sarah shook her head, fiddling with the sleeve of her blouse. "No, not with the models. Look, I don't want to pry into something that's none of my business, but people are talking about you and Matt in the office." Allison felt her stomach clench. "What are they saying?" Her voice was quieter than she expected. "Well," Sarah hesitated, "that you two are close, outside of work. Someone saw you at a bar last week, and it seems that it got back to Thomas." Thomas Brown was their boss, the marketing director. Strict but fair, he did not tolerate breaches of corporate ethics. Allison swallowed, trying to remain calm. "It's just a rumor," she said. "Matt and I are colleagues. Sometimes we discuss projects outside the office. Nothing serious." Sarah nodded, but her look was skeptical. "I believe you, but be careful. Thomas called Matt to his office this morning, and you were asked to come by after the meeting." Allison forced a smile. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll figure it out." Sarah left, and Allison remained in the office, her hands shaking. She opened her work chat to message Matt, but decided against it. If word had gotten back to Thomas, any message could make things worse. She tried to focus on her presentation, but her thoughts were racing. The meeting went smoothly. Allison pitched the campaign, answered questions, even received praise from the client. But she felt her colleagues' eyes the entire time, or did she just imagine it? After the meeting, she headed to Thomas's office, trying to look confident. Thomas, a 55-year-old man with graying hair at the temples, sat at his desk, looking over papers. He looked up as Allison entered. "Have a seat, Allison," he said, gesturing to a chair. She sat down, clasping her hands in her lap. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, trying to sound calm. Thomas put the papers down, his face serious. "Yes, we have a problem. I've heard rumors about your personal connection with Matt Riley. Is that true?" Allison felt her cheeks heat up. She wanted to lie, but Thomas was looking right at her, and she knew he wouldn't believe her. "We sometimes met outside of work," she admitted, "but it doesn't affect our duties." Thomas shook his head. "Allison, you know our policy. Personal relationships between employees, especially those that give rise to rumors, undermine professional reputation. I spoke with Matt today. He claims it was irregular, but I cannot ignore the complaints of colleagues." "Complaints?" Allison asked, her voice shaking. "Who complained?" "It doesn't matter," Thomas frowned. "What matters is that the situation has gotten out of control. Clients are starting to ask questions, and I can't risk the company's reputation." Allison gripped the arms of her chair. "Thomas, I'm one of the best on the team. You know how much I've done for this campaign. This shouldn't affect my work." "I agree, you are a valuable employee," he said. "But I cannot turn a blind eye to an ethical violation. I will have to fire you. Matt has been given a warning, but he will remain since his role is less visible." Allison froze. Fire her? She had worked at this company for 7 years, rising from zero to senior marketer. It wasn't just a job, it was her identity. "Please," she said quietly, "give me a chance to make it right. I won't date Matt, Thomas raised his hand, stopping her. "The decision has been made. You will be paid compensation for 2 months. hand in your pass and laptop to the HR department by the end of the day. Allison nodded, feeling her throat tighten. She stood up, walked out of the office, and closed the door. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, trying to breathe evenly. Everything she had worked for had been ruined by her own stupidity. Allison packed the things in her office into a box. Photos of Sophie, a mug with the company logo, a notepad with notes. Coworkers walked past, avoiding her gaze. She tried to find Matt, but his office was empty. She texted him, "I got fired. Where are you?" There was no answer. She sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the box in the passenger seat. Her career, her reputation are all gone. And waiting at home was David, who knew about her affair and barely spoke to her. Allison turned on the ignition and drove home, feeling her life falling apart. The house was quiet. Sophie was at school, David was at work. Allison put the box in the hallway and sat on the couch, staring at the wall. She remembered how she had started at the company. The first projects, Thomas's praise, the pride when she was promoted. Now she was a nobody, not a professional, not a good wife, not a mother. She opened her phone, hoping for a text from Matt. Nothing. She texted again, "Matt, we need to talk. This is serious." Half an hour later, he responded, "Sorry, busy. Call later." His coldness hit her harder than Thomas's words. Matt, who had promised to be there, who had pushed her to take risks, was now pulling away. Allison felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had ruined her career, her marriage, her relationship with Sophie, and for what? For a man who had no intention of taking responsibility. That evening David came home. He saw the box in the hallway but said nothing. Sophie was upstairs doing her homework. Allison was making dinner, trying to look busy. "The lasagna will be ready soon," she said without turning around. David nodded, placing his briefcase on the floor. "Okay," his voice was even emotionless. Allison turned to face him, her hands shaking. "David, I got fired today." He looked at her, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Why?" he asked, but there was no surprise in his tone. Allison was standing at the stove, stirring lasagna sauce, when David walked into the house. He spotted the cardboard box in the hallway, her things from the office, and stopped, his face tense. Sophie was upstairs, doing her homework. Allison turned to him, her hands shaking, but she forced herself to speak. "David, I got fired today," she said, her voice barely audible. He put his briefcase on the floor, his gaze becoming harder. "Why?" he asked, crossing his arms. Allison swallowed, feeling her heart pounding. She wanted to soften the truth, but his eyes, full of weariness and suspicion, prevented her from lying entirely. "Because of rumors," she said, looking away, "that I was being too close to a colleague. They said it was damaging to my reputation." David was silent, his jaw clenched. He took a step forward, his voice lower. "Rumors?" he asked again. "Are these the same meetings that keep you late every evening?" Allison winced, her eyes filling with tears. She knew he'd seen her texts, but she wasn't ready to confront him directly. She shook her head, trying to buy herself time. "It's not what you think," she said. "Just gossip. I'll look into it." David looked at her for a few seconds, then turned away, clenching his fists. His voice was cold, but trembling with suppressed emotion. "I don't want to talk about it now," he said. "Sophie will be down soon." He went into the living room, leaving Allison in the kitchen. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to hold back the tears. His words confirmed that he knew more than he was saying, and that scared her more than any scream. There was tension in the air at dinner. Sophie sat at the table, staring at the lasagna she was barely eating. She was 18, and she had noticed for a week that her parents barely spoke to each other. Allison tried to keep her composure, but her fingers shook as she reached for her glass of water. David ate in silence, his eyes glued to his plate. Sophie put down her fork and looked at them, her voice sharp. "Stop pretending," she said, crossing her arms. "What's going on? You're not even looking at each other." Allison forced herself to meet her daughter's gaze, but her throat tightened. She wanted to lie, But the words sounded false even in her head. "I'm having trouble at work, Sophie," she said, her voice shaking. "It's complicated." Sophie narrowed her dark eyes darting between her mother and father. "Problems at work?" she asked again. "Then why is Dad like this? He doesn't talk at all." David looked up, his face tense. He looked at Sophie, then at Allison, his voice low, almost menacing. "Sophie, it's none of your business," he said. "Eat and don't interfere." Sophie jumped up, her chair creaking on the floor. "Seriously?" She threw the napkin on the table. "You're both lying to my face. I'm not a child. I can see that something is wrong." She ran out of the kitchen, her footsteps thundering down the stairs. Allison started to run after her, but David stood up first, putting his plate in the sink. He looked at Allison, his eyes cold. "I'll deal with her," he said, and went upstairs. Allison remained at the table, her food growing cold, realizing that her attempts to hide the truth were only deepening the gulf between her and her family. Allison sat in her empty living room, scrolling through a job board. It had been a month since she had been fired for rumors of an affair with Matt Riley. She had sent out dozens of resumes, but had received no responses. At home, things were even worse. David only talked to her about Sophie or household matters, slept on the couch, and avoided any personal conversations. Sophie was becoming more and more distant, spending time with her friend Hannah or locking herself in her room. Allison felt like she was losing her family, and she decided it was time to make a change. She opened her phone and dialed the number she found on a psychological counseling website. A female voice answered on the second ring. "Dr. Harris's office, how can I help you?" The voice was calm, professional. "Hello," Allison swallowed. "I'd like to make an appointment. My name is Allison Clark." "Of course," the woman replied. "Dr. Harris sees patients on weekdays. When is it convenient for you?" "The sooner the better," said Allison. "Will tomorrow morning?" "Tomorrow at 10 is free," the woman confirmed. "Will it be an individual session?" "Yes," Allison hesitated. "Individual for now." She hung up, feeling a little relieved. Therapy had been her attempt to understand herself, to understand why she had ruined her life for a fleeting affair. She didn't know if it would help, but sitting around doing nothing was unbearable. The next day, Allison walked into Dr. Linda Harris's office, located in a small office building in downtown Seattle. The office was bright, with beige walls, a comfortable couch, and a shelf filled with books. Dr. Harris, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a warm smile, rose from her desk to say hello. "Allison, it's good to see you," she said, extending her hand. "Have a seat." Allison sat down on the couch, clutching her purse in her lap. She felt awkward, as if she was about to be judged. "I don't know where to start," she admitted, looking at her hands. "Start with what brought you here." Dr. Harris sat down opposite her voice calm but attentive. "What's going on?" Allison took a deep breath. She told him everything, about her marriage to David, which had become routine, about her affair with Matt, which had promised freedom but had ended in her being fired, about David finding the messages and now barely speaking to her, about Sophie, who blamed her for everything. She spoke quickly, her voice shaking, but Dr. Harris listened silently, nodding occasionally. "I don't know how to fix it," Allison finished, her eyes filling with tears. "I lost my job, my family. I don't know who I am anymore." Dr. Harris put down the notepad she had been taking notes on and looked at Allison. "This is a big burden, Allison," she said. "You took a step by coming here, and that already shows your desire to change something. Let's try to figure out why you started an affair with Matt. What were you looking for?" Allison thought about it. She had never asked herself that question so directly. "I felt empty," she said. "David was a good husband, but everything was the same. The job, the house, Sophie. I wanted something new, something to make me feel alive." "And Matt gave you that feeling?" Dr. Harris asked. "Yes," Allison nodded. "He was different. Free, easy. But now I realize it was an illusion. He left me as soon as everything fell apart. Dr. Harris nodded, her gaze sympathetic but not judgmental. Sometimes we look for external solutions to internal problems, she said. The affair with Matt was an attempt to fill a void, but it didn't resolve your feelings. What do you think caused that void? Allison was silent, her fingers fiddling with the strap of her purse. She thought back to her life before the affair, the endless errands, the expectations, the pressure to be the perfect wife and mother. She had never asked herself what she really wanted. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe I'm just tired of being what everyone expects me to be. Dr. Harris smiled, her voice soft. That's a good start, Allison. You've started asking yourself questions. Let's keep working on that. What do you think you want now? Allison swallowed, her eyes filling with tears again. I want my family back, she said. But David won't listen to me, and Sophie. She hates me. It's going to be hard, Dr. Harris said. But the first step is to understand yourself. Once you understand your motives, you can be honest with them. Would you like to try inviting David to a session together? Allison nodded, although she wasn't sure if he would agree. I'll ask, she said, but he's very closed off right now. That's okay, Dr. Harris stood up, holding out a business card. Start small. We'll meet in a week. If David agrees, I'll be happy to see you both. Allison took the card, feeling a glimmer of hope. She didn't know if therapy would help, but for the first time in a month, she felt like she was doing something right. At home, Allison waited for the right moment to talk to David. He had returned from work, brought groceries, and started cooking dinner chicken and rice. Sophie was at Hannah's, and the house was quiet. Allison walked into the kitchen, her heart pounding. David, can I talk? She asked, standing in the doorway. He turned around, holding the knife, his face neutral. About what? He asked, returning to chopping vegetables. I signed up for therapy, Allison said, her voice quiet. Today was my first session. I'm trying to figure out everything. David nodded without looking up. Okay, he said, if it helps you. Allison clenched her fists, gathering her courage. The doctor suggested joint sessions, she said, for the two of us, so we could talk. David paused, his hand hovering over the cutting board. He looked at her, his eyes cold. Joint sessions, he asked again. Why? To save our marriage, Allison stepped closer, her voice shaking. I know I'm to blame, David. I want to make it right. He shook his head, his voice low but firm. Do you think there's anything left to save? He said. I'm holding on for Sophie, but don't ask me to pretend it can be restored. Allison felt her eyes fill with tears. She wanted to protest, but his words were like a wall. Please, she said, just try, just once. David turned away, continuing to chop vegetables. I said no, he repeated. Allison nodded, her throat tight. She left the kitchen, feeling the hope she had felt during the session fading. David didn't want to forgive her, and she didn't know how to convince him. Sophie returned home for dinner, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She sat down at the table, staring at a plate of chicken and rice. Allison tried to make conversation, but her voice was hesitant. How is Hannah doing? She asked, pouring water into a glass. It's fine, Sophie shrugged, not looking up. We were preparing for exams. That's great, Allison nodded. If you need help with your studies, I'll... No need, Sophie snapped, her voice sharp. I can handle it. Allison looked at David for support, but he ate in silence, his eyes glued to his plate. Dinner passed in silence, broken only by the clink of forks. Sophie went upstairs as soon as she had finished, and David began clearing the dishes. Allison remained at the table, her hands shaking. She wanted to talk to Sophie, to explain that she was trying to change, but her daughter wouldn't give her a chance. She remembered Dr. Harris's words, the first step is to understand yourself. But how could she understand herself when everything she loved was slipping away? At the next session, Allison told Dr. Harris about her conversation with David. She was sitting on the same couch, her eyes red from crying. He refused, she said. He said he wasn't ready. I don't know what to do. Dr. Harris nodded, her voice calm. It's his choice, Allison, she said. You can't force him, but you can work on yourself. How do you feel when he refuses? Allison swallowed, her fingers tightening on the arm of the sofa. I feel guilty, she admitted, and afraid that he'll never forgive me, that Sophie will hate me forever. Guilt is natural, Dr. Harris said. You made a choice that led to consequences, but guilt can be useful if it motivates you to change. Why do you think you're so afraid of losing them? Allison thought about it. She thought back to her life before the affair. She was a wife, a mother, a professional. Without it, she didn't know who she was. They were all I had, she said. Without them, I'm nothing. Dr. Harris shook her head, her voice firm. You're not nobody, Allison, she said. You're a person who's made mistakes, but you have a chance to find yourself. It's going to be a long road, but it starts with you. Sophie sat on the living room couch, leafing through her biology textbook. She was 18, studying for her college entrance exams, but she couldn't concentrate. The house had been a battlefield for the past few months. Her father was silent, her mother looked guilty, and their conversations were empty phrases. Sophie knew something was wrong, but no one was telling the truth. She closed the textbook and looked at David, who was sitting at the table, checking something on his laptop. Dad, can you explain what's going on? She asked, her voice sharp. I'm tired of your secrets. David looked up, his face tense. He was 45, and the last few weeks had left him with a tired look in his eyes. He closed his laptop, but didn't answer right away. Sophie crossed her arms, her dark curls falling over her shoulders. Sophie, it's none of your business, he said finally, his voice low. Focus on your studies. None of my business. Sophie jumped up, her eyes sparkling. You and Mom can barely talk. She lost her job. You're sleeping on the couch. I'm not blind, Dad. David's jaw tightened, his fingers tapping the table. He didn't want to have this conversation. A month ago, he'd found Allison's text messages to Matt, a colleague, and her messages had confirmed his worst suspicions. But he hadn't talked to her about it and hadn't wanted to ruin his family for Sophie. Now, her direct gaze made him feel cornered. My mother and we have problems, he said carefully. Adult matters. It shouldn't worry you. Sophie stepped closer, her voice growing louder. Problems? She asked. Is she dating someone? Is this why? David froze, his face turning pale. He hadn't expected Sophie to figure it out so quickly. He wanted to lie, but her eyes, full of pain and anger, didn't give him a chance. Sophie, he began, but she interrupted. Just tell the truth, she screamed. I know she's lying. All those late hours, and then she got fired for rumors. She cheated on you, didn't she? David swallowed, his hands clenched into fists. He didn't want Sophie to find out, but the lie seemed pointless now. I found messages, he said quietly. With a colleague, I don't know everything, but yeah, it looks like that. Sophie recoiled, her eyes filling with tears. She shook her head as if she refused to believe it. And you just keep quiet? Her voice trembled. Why didn't you throw her out? Why are we still here? Because you're my daughter, David stood up, his voice firm. I don't want you to suffer before college. We'll figure this out, but you need to hang in there. Sophie wiped away her tears, her face red with anger. You'll figure it out. She snorted. She ruined everything, and you pretend nothing happened. I don't want to see her. She ran out of the living room, her footsteps thundering down the stairs. David sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. He knew he had made things worse, but he couldn't lie to his daughter any longer. Allison returned home from another session with Dr. Harris. The therapy was helping her understand her motives, but nothing had changed at home. She walked into the kitchen, set her bag down on the table, and heard the door slam upstairs. Sophie came down the stairs, her eyes red and her face tense. Sophie, are you okay? Allison asked, stepping towards her. Sophie stopped, her eyes full of fury. Don't pretend you care, she shouted. I know about you and your colleague. You cheated on your dad. Allison froze, her heart skipping a beat. She wanted to ask how Sophie knew, but her daughter didn't give her the chance. Dad told me. Sophie clenched her fists. How could you? You destroyed our family. Because of you, he is unhappy. Because of you, I can't live a normal life. Sophie, please. Allison stepped closer, her voice shaking. It's not that simple. I made a mistake, but I'm trying to make it right. Fix it. Sophie snorted, her eyes filling with tears. You lost your job. You lied to us all. You expect me to believe your apology. Allison swallowed, her hands shaking. She wanted to hug Sophie, but her daughter retreated. I don't want to listen to you, Sophie said. I hate you. She turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Allison sank into a chair, her eyes filling with tears. She knew Sophie had every right to be angry, but her words cut like a knife. Their relationship, already fragile, was now in tatters. Sophie sat in her best friend Hannah's room. Hannah, a 19-year-old college student at the local college, was lying on her bed, scrolling through her phone. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her eyes were bright with curiosity. Okay, tell me everything, Hannah said, putting her phone down. What's going on with your parents? Sophie wiped away her tears, her voice hoarse. Mom cheated on Dad, she said. With some coworkers. Dad found her messages, and she got fired because of it. Now they barely talk, and I don't know what to do. Hannah narrowed her eyes, her voice full of sarcasm. Seriously? Your mom? I thought she was so proper. It's a classic, boring housewife looking for adventure. Sophie clenched her fists, her face turning red. She's not a housewife, she said. She was a marketer. But yeah, she screwed it up. Hannah sat up, her tone sharpening. Spoiled? Sophie, she betrayed you. And your dad. People like her always think only of themselves. My mother was the same. She had an affair, and then she left my father and me. Don't believe her apologies. Sophie was silent, her eyes filling with tears again. She wanted to protect her mother, but Hannah's words hit home. Allison was lying, destroying the family, and her attempts to fix them felt hollow. I don't know how to talk to her now, Sophie admitted. I don't want to see her. Hannah nodded, her voice firm. No need. Let her sort out her own mess. You focus on college. Get away from them. Start your own life. Sophie nodded, but her heart was clenched. She loved her mother, despite her anger, but now she couldn't find it in herself to forgive her. Allison was sitting in the kitchen when David walked in. He noticed her red eyes, but said nothing. She stood up, her voice quiet. Sophie knows, she said. She said you told. Why, David? He turned to face her, his face tired. She's not a child, Allison, he said. She could see that something was wrong. I couldn't lie anymore. Allison swallowed, her hands shaking. She hates me, she said. I tried to explain, but she won't listen. David shook his head, his voice cold. These are your consequences, he said. You made a choice. Now live with it. He walked into the living room, leaving her alone. Allison sank into a chair, her tears dripping onto the table. She wanted to make things right, but Sophie and David were pushing her away. She remembered Dr. Harris's words, "You can't make them forgive you." But without their forgiveness, she didn't know how to move on. At the next session, Allison told Dr. Harris about Sophie. She was sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. She said she hates me, Allison admitted. I don't know how to get through to her. Dr. Harris nodded, her voice calm. Sophie feels betrayed, she said. Her anger is a response to pain. Give her time, but keep showing that you want to change. Allison swallowed, her fingers tightening on the armrest. What if she never forgives? She asked. I can't lose her. You can't control her feelings, Dr. Harris said. But you can work on yourself. When she sees you change, she may soften, but it will take time. Allison sat in the living room, scrolling through job postings on her laptop. It had been almost a year since she had been fired for rumors of an affair with Matt Riley. She had found a temporary job at a small advertising firm, But it was not a career, it was survival. At home, things had not improved. Today was Sophie's graduation. Allison closed her laptop and went upstairs to change. She chose a navy blue dress and light makeup, trying to look put together. In the mirror, she saw a 43-year-old woman whose eyes betrayed fatigue. She wanted this day to be special for Sophie, even if her daughter hated her. David walked into the bedroom, adjusting his tie. His brown hair was neatly combed, but his face was expressionless. "Are you ready?" he asked without looking at her. "Yes," Allison replied, picking up her purse. "Is Sophie ready yet?" "Downstairs," he said and went out. Allison walked down to the living room where Sophie stood in a black dress and graduation gown. Her dark curls were loose and her face was tense. She looked at Allison but said nothing. "You look beautiful," Allison said, trying to smile. "I'm proud of you." Sophie nodded, her voice cold. "Thank you," she said, turning to David. "Dad, shall we go?" David took the keys and they walked out to the car. Allison sat in the back seat, feeling like a stranger. She wanted to talk to Sophie, but her daughter was looking out the window, listening to music through her headphones. David was silent, focused on the road. Allison clutched her purse, clinging to the faint hope that this day would bring them closer. The graduation ceremony took place in the school gym. Parents and students filled the stands, the air thick with laughter and applause. Allison sat next to David, but there was an invisible wall between them. Sophie received her diploma, her name earning a loud ovation from Hannah and her other friends. Allison clapped, her eyes filling with tears, but she wasn't sure if it was from pride or pain. After the ceremony, Sophie walked up to them, holding her diploma. Hannah, with her blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail, stood next to her, smiling. "Congratulations, Sophie," Allison said, stepping toward her daughter. "It's such a big day." Sophie nodded, her gaze distant. "Yeah, thanks," she said. "Hannah, let's go take a photo." Hannah glanced at Allison, her smile tight. "Of course," she said. "Let's go before the crowd gathers." They walked away, leaving Allison with David. Allison turned to him, her voice quiet. "She doesn't even want to talk to me," she said. "Maybe we could have a family dinner, celebrate?" David looked at her, his eyes cold. "She's celebrating with friends," he said. Allison swallowed, her throat tightening. She nodded and walked toward the car, feeling her hopes crumble. David sat in his office, looking at the paperwork he'd received from his lawyer. He'd started divorce counseling months ago, but he hadn't told Allison. Sophie would soon be turning 18, and he no longer saw the point in staying married. He planned to file for divorce as soon as Sophie left for college. She had been accepted to the University of Washington, and her departure to the dorms in 2 months would give him freedom. He didn't know how Sophie would react, but he hoped her new life would soften the blow. As for Allison, he felt nothing but exhaustion. She went to therapy, tried to talk to him, but he couldn't forgive her betrayal. The office door opened and Sophie walked in. She was holding the phone, her face serious. "Dad, are you busy?" she asked, sitting down on the sofa. "No," David put the papers aside. "How was graduation? Did you have fun?" "Yeah, fine," Sophie shrugged. "Hannah threw a party, it was awesome. But I wanted to ask about you and your mom." David tensed, his fingers tightening on the pen. "What exactly?" he asked. Sophie looked at him, her voice quiet. "You're going to get a divorce, right?" she asked. "I see the way you look at her, as if she's not here." David swallowed, his heart clenching. He didn't want to lie, but the truth was too hard. "We're not in a good place," he said carefully, "but I want you to focus on college. We'll figure it out." Sophie shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "You'll figure it out?" she asked. "She ruined everything, Dad. Why are you still here?" "Because you're my daughter," he said, his voice firm. "I don't want you to suffer, but I'll figure this out, Sophie. I promise." She nodded, wiping away tears, and left. David remained in the office, feeling his resolve strengthen. He couldn't live with Allison any longer. Divorce was the only way out. Allison sat in her bedroom, looking at the graduation photo Hannah had posted on social media. Sophie was smiling with her friends, but Allison wasn't in the picture. She felt like an outsider in her daughter's life. Therapy with Dr. Harris was helping her understand her mistakes, but it wasn't bringing her family back. She still hoped that David would soften, that Sophie would forgive her, but every day that hope grew weaker. She went down to the kitchen where David was making coffee. His movements were mechanical, as if he was going through a routine automatically. "David," she said, her voice quiet, "maybe we could go somewhere, the three of us, with Sophie, like before." He turned, his gaze empty. "Somewhere?" he asked again. "Why?" "To be a family." Allison clenched her fists. "I know it's my fault, but I'm trying. Please give me a chance." David shook his head, his voice cold. "I'm here for Sophie," he said. "Don't ask for more." He took the coffee and went into the study. Allison remained in the kitchen, her eyes filling with tears. She clung to the hope that he would change his mind, but his words were like a death sentence. A week later, Sophie celebrated her 18th birthday. Allison baked a cake, bought a present, a new backpack for college, and decorated the living room with balloons. She hoped the birthday would bring them closer together. David helped with the decorations, but his face was expressionless. Sophie returned home with Hannah, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw the cake and balloons. "Is this all for me?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. "Of course," Allison smiled, her heart pounding. "Happy birthday, Sophie." Sophie nodded, but her smile was forced. She opened the gift, thanked her, but did not hug Allison. Hannah, sitting on the couch, watched the scene with a slight grin. "It's a cool backpack," she said. "But Sophie, you're still going to get a new one in college, right?" Sophie shrugged, her voice quiet. "Maybe," she said, "but this one is normal." Allison felt a twinge of pain, but said nothing. Dinner was quiet. Pizza, cake, a few stories from Hannah. Sophie smiled, but avoided her mother's gaze. David said little, his mind elsewhere. After dinner, Sophie and Hannah went upstairs. Allison was clearing away the dishes when David came into the kitchen. She was happy, Allison said, trying to start a conversation. "Maybe it was start." David looked at her, his voice even. "Don't have any illusions," he said. "She's grown up. She'll be leaving soon. We did what we could." He left, leaving her alone. Allison pressed her lips together, holding back tears. She knew he was right, but she couldn't stop hoping. She went back to the bedroom, opened her laptop, and texted Dr. Harris, asking for an appointment for an emergency session. She didn't know how to live without her family, but she was ready to fight, even if David and Sophie didn't believe in her. Allison sat in the kitchen, stirring her coffee, which had grown cold. It had been a month since Sophie's 18th birthday, and her daughter was preparing to move into her dorm at the University of Washington. Allison was still working at a small advertising firm, but her thoughts were on her family. Therapy with Dr. Harris was helping Allison figure herself out, but it wasn't bringing her husband or daughter back. She clung to the hope that time would fix everything, but every day that hope grew weaker. The door opened and David walked in, holding a folder of papers. His face was serious but calm. Allison looked at him. Her heart sank. He rarely came home in the middle of the day. "You're early," she said, putting the mug on the table. "Is everything okay?" David put the folder on the table and sat down opposite her. His gaze was direct, looking into her eyes for the first time in months. "We need to talk," he said, his voice even. Allison froze, her hands shaking. She knew this moment would come, but she still wasn't ready. "What do you mean?" she asked, although she already understood. David opened the folder and pulled out papers. Allison saw the heading, "Application for Dissolution of Marriage." Her throat tightened and she swallowed, trying to stay calm. "I'm filing for divorce," David said, his tone businesslike. "Sophie's 18 now, and she's going away to college. There's no reason to pretend anymore." Allison shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "David, please," she said, her voice shaking. We can try. I'm in therapy. I'm changing. Give me a chance. He looked at her, his face unreadable. A chance? He asked. Allison, you cheated on me. You ruined everything. Allison flinched. It was the first time he'd openly mentioned her affair with Matt. She wanted to explain, to say it was a mistake, but his gaze stopped her. I know it's my fault, she said quietly, but I want to make it right. For Sophie, for us. David shook his head, his voice growing harder. Sophie's not a child, he said. She knows what you did, and she won't talk to you. And I've had enough. Allison clenched her fists, her tears dripping onto the table. She remembered their wedding, Sophie's birth, their trips to the lake. It all seemed distant, like someone else's life. Please, she whispered, don't do this. We can go to therapy together, start over. David stood up, his voice cold. I did what I could for Sophie, he said. Now I'm doing it for myself. Sign the papers, Allison. Don't make it complicated. He put his pen down on the table and walked out. Allison was left alone, looking at the papers. She wanted to run after him, to beg, but her legs wouldn't move. She opened the papers, her hands shaking. The terms were simple. Split the property in half, keep the house, no alimony. David wanted nothing more than freedom. That night, David packed his suitcase. Allison sat in the bedroom, listening to him open the cupboards in the spare room. She wanted to go downstairs and talk, but she knew it was no use. Sophie was at Hannah's, and the house was eerily quiet. David walked into the bedroom holding his jacket, his face tired but determined. I'm leaving, he said. I'll stay with a friend until I find an apartment. Sophie knows. Allison stood up, her eyes red from crying. David, don't go, she said. We can work this out. I'll do whatever you want. He shook his head, his voice quiet. It's over, Allison, he said. He turned and walked away. Allison heard the front door slam. His car started. She sank down on the bed, her tears falling silently. The house they had built together was now empty, and she was alone. The next day, Sophie returned home to pick up the last of her things before moving into the dorm. Allison met her in the hallway, her face pale but trying to keep her composure. Sophie, she said, her voice weak. Daddy's gone. He filed for divorce. Sophie stopped, holding the box of books. Her dark eyes looked at her mother, but there was no surprise in them, only weariness. I know, she said. He wrote to me yesterday. Allison swallowed, her hands shaking. She wanted to hug Sophie, but she was afraid her daughter would push her away. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said. I know you're angry, but I love you. Please give me a chance. Sophie shook her head, her voice cold. You've made your choice, Mom, she said. I don't want to talk about it. I need to get ready. She walked past, up to her room, and closed the door. Allison stood in the hallway, her heart breaking. Sophie was her last link to her family, but even she didn't want to listen to her. Allison sat in her office at a small advertising firm, reviewing a layout for a local client. 3 months had passed since David had filed for divorce and left home. Sophie had moved into a dorm at the University of Washington and was barely responding to her texts. Allison continued to go to therapy with Dr. Harris, sorting out her mistakes, but the emptiness in her life remained. The house where they had once been a family now seemed too big for one person. She tried to fill her days with work and sessions, but each evening she returned to the silence. Her phone buzzed a text from Carol, her friend who owned a coffee shop in downtown Seattle. Meet me at 5. We need to talk. Allison responded, Yeah, I will. She didn't know what Carol wanted to talk about, but the meeting was a chance to break out of her routine. David stood in a Belltown yoga studio, rolling up his mat. He was 45, but his regular practice helped him cope with stress. After his divorce, he had rented a small apartment near his job and was rebuilding his life. Sophie, now a college student, called him once a week, but their conversations were brief. He tried not to think about Allison, but her betrayal still left a bitter taste. Good workout, said the woman next to him, putting away her mat. Her name was Jenna Lewis, and she was 35, a yoga instructor with long brown hair and a warm smile. They had met a month earlier when David had signed up for her class. "Yeah, thanks," David replied, wiping sweat from his face. "Do you always give it your all?" Jenna laughed, her voice light. "I have to," she said. "Otherwise the students will run away. Will you go for coffee after?" David hesitated. Jenna had suggested meeting outside the studio a couple of times before, but he wasn't sure he was ready for something new. But her openness and energy drew him in like nothing he had in years. "Okay," he said, "go ahead." They sat down at a cafe across the street, ordering lattes and black coffees. Jenna talked about her life. She'd moved from Portland 2 years ago, loved to travel, and was working on opening her own studio. David talked about his work as an engineer and Sophie, avoiding the topic of his divorce. For the first time in a long time, he felt relaxed, like he could just be himself. "You should come to my class on Saturday," Jenna said, sipping her coffee. "There's more movement there. You'll like it." David smiled, his voice warm. "Agreed," he replied. When they said goodbye, he realized that he wanted to see her again. It was a new feeling, and it scared him, but he was willing to try. Sophie was sitting in a campus cafe, leafing through a psychology textbook. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "I can come over this weekend. Want to grab dinner?" She smiled and replied, "Yeah, cool." She had tried to stay in touch with her father since her parents' divorce, but she hadn't had much contact with Allison. When she found out about her mother's affair a year ago, she couldn't forgive her for lying. Sophie blamed Allison for the breakup of the family and didn't want to give her a chance. On Saturday, David arrived on campus, and Sophie noticed that he looked better than before. His eyes were brighter, his smile more genuine. They sat down at a restaurant, ordering burgers and fries. "How are classes?" David asked, biting into his burger. "It's fine," Sophie replied, shrugging. "Psychology is interesting, but the exams are stressful. How are you? Are you okay?" David nodded, his voice calm. "Yes," he said. "I go to yoga, it helps. And I met someone." Sophie raised her eyebrows, her fork hovering over her plate. "With someone?" she asked again. "You mean a girl?" "Her name is Jenna," David said. "She's a yoga instructor. We just hang out, but she's nice." Sophie was silent, digesting the news. She hadn't expected her father to find someone so quickly, but he sounded happy, and that was more important. "Cool," she said finally. "Is she normal?" David smiled, his eyes softening. "Yes," he said. "Maybe I'll introduce you sometime." Sophie nodded, her voice warm. "Okay," she said. "I'm happy for you, Dad." She didn't mention Allison, and David didn't bring it up. Sophie knew her mother wrote to her, but she rarely responded, keeping her distance. Jenna, whoever she was, wasn't a replacement for her mother, but Sophie was willing to accept her if she made her father happy. Allison sat in Carol's coffee shop, holding a mug of latte. Carol, her friend, sat across from her, her dark hair pulled back into a ponytail. The coffee shop was full of people, but their table in the corner offered privacy. "You look better," Carol said, sipping her tea. "Is the therapy helping?" "A little," Allison said, her voice quiet. "I'm learning to live for myself, but the house is empty. Sophie isn't answering, David's gone." Carol nodded, her face turning serious. "Listen, I wanted to tell you," she began. "I saw David last week, at a cafe with a woman. They seemed close." Allison froze, her fingers tightening around her mug. She knew David had a right to a new life, but the news hit her like a knife. "With a woman?" she asked again. "Who is she?" "I don't know," Carol shrugged. "About 35, long hair, smiling. They were drinking coffee, laughing. I didn't want to upset you, but you should know." Allison swallowed, her eyes filling with tears. She imagined David with another woman, happy, free of her mistakes. It hurt more than him leaving. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice shaking. I should have waited." Carol touched her hand, her voice soft. "You can do this, Allison," she said. "You're stronger than you think." Allison nodded, but her heart sank. She knew David wasn't coming back, but the news of his new life made the divorce more real. That night, Allison lay in her bedroom, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of the living room clock. She opened her phone to text Sophie, but stopped. Instead, she scrolled through her social media and saw a photo of Sophie and David at a restaurant, both smiling. The caption read, "Dinner with Dad." Allison felt a twinge of pain. Sophie was happy with her father, but not with her. She remembered what Carol had said about the woman with David. It wasn't her life, but the thought that he had found someone else made her feel even more alone. She opened her laptop and wrote to Dr. Harris, asking for an appointment. She didn't know how to deal with this pain, but she was willing to keep working on herself. At the session, Allison told Dr. Harris the news. She was sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. "He met someone," she said, her voice shaking. "And Sophie. She's with him, but not with me. I feel like I've lost them forever." Dr. Harris nodded, her voice calm. "It hurts, Allison," she said. "You see them moving on, and you stay where you are. How do you feel?" Allison swallowed, her fingers tightening on the armrest. "Envy," she admitted, "and guilt. I destroyed our family, and now they are happy without me." Allison stood in the waiting room of her local Seattle homeless shelter, clutching a folder with her shift schedule. It had been 6 months since she'd learned of David's new life with Jenna, and almost a year since their divorce. She was 43, working at a small advertising firm, but her life still felt empty. Sophie, now a 19-year-old student at the University of Washington, responded to her messages once a month, curtly and coldly. Therapy with Dr. Harris had helped Allison accept her mistakes, but it hadn't filled her loneliness. 2 weeks ago, she'd signed up to volunteer at the shelter, hoping to find meaning outside her broken family. "Allison, are you ready?" asked Sarah, the shelter coordinator, a woman in her 50s with short blonde hair. "We're helping with the food drive today." "Yes," Allison replied, adjusting her badge. "Where to?" Sarah pointed to the kitchen, where pots of hot soup and trays of sandwiches were already set out. Allison put on gloves and began serving the food, feeling useful for the first time in a long time. The people who came to the shelter were all different. Older men, young women with children, teenagers with backpacks. She smiled at everyone, trying not to think about her own life. "Thank you," said the man in the shabby jacket, taking the plate. His eyes were tired but grateful. Allison nodded, her voice warm. "Please," she replied. Working at the shelter was hard, but it gave her a sense of purpose. She remembered Dr. Harris's words, "Find something that's bigger than you." Volunteering became her way of dealing with guilt and loneliness. At home, Allison sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. Sophie hadn't texted since her last birthday, when Allison had sent her a gift, a psychology book, and an apology card. Sophie had replied, "Thanks, received." Allison wanted to call, but she was afraid of rejection. Instead, she opened her laptop and texted Dr. Harris, asking to schedule a session. She knew she couldn't force Sophie to forgive, but she held out a glimmer of hope. The next day, she met Carol at her coffee shop. Carol, her friend, was sitting at the counter, wiping mugs. Her dark hair was pulled back into a bun, and her eyes were curious. "How's volunteering going?" Carol asked, placing a latte in front of Allison. "Okay," Allison said, sipping her coffee. "I'm tired, but it helps. I feel like I'm doing something worthwhile." Carol nodded, her voice soft. "You've changed," she said. "Before, you seemed lost. Now you have strength." Allison smiled, her eyes sad. "I don't know if it's strength," she said. "I'm just trying to move on. But Sophie, she doesn't want to see me." Carol touched her hand, her voice firm. "Give her time," she said. "She's young, she's angry, but you're her mother. She'll come back when she's ready." Allison nodded, but her heart sank. She wanted to believe Carol, But every missed call from Sophie reminded her of the consequences of her affair with Matt. She had destroyed her family, and now she had to live with it. David sat in Jenna's apartment, holding a mug of tea. They had been dating for 6 months, and her small studio with its plants and colorful pillows had become a second home to him. Jenna, a 35-year-old yoga instructor, sat across from him, her chestnut-colored hair loose. She was talking about a new class she was planning to open, but David was only half listening. His mind was on Sophie, who was visiting for the weekend. "Are you okay?" Jenna asked, her voice soft. "You're kind of quiet." David nodded, his eyes tired. "Yes," he said. "I'm just thinking about Sophie. She's coming tomorrow, and I want you to meet her." Jenna smiled, her eyes warm. "I'm ready," she said. "If she's as cool as you say, we'll get along." David smiled, relieved. Jenna was the opposite of Allison, open, easygoing, without the baggage of a past. He didn't talk about his marriage, but Jenna knew he was divorced, and that Sophie blamed her mother for the breakup. David hoped that Jenna would be a new person in Sophie's life, not a replacement. Sophie arrived in Seattle on Saturday, her backpack stuffed with textbooks. She met David and Jenna at a cafe near campus. Jenna was everything her father had described: easygoing, smiling, and easygoing. They ordered sandwiches and coffee, and Sophie listened as Jenna talked about yoga and her dog. "You should come to my class," Jenna said, looking at Sophie. "It helps relieve the stress of exams." Sophie smiled, her voice warm. "Maybe," she said. "That sounds cool." She looked at her father, who looked happier than he had a year ago. Sophie was happy for him, but the thought of her mother still made her angry. Allison had written to her last week, but Sophie hadn't responded. She wasn't ready to talk, not after her lies had destroyed their family. "How are studies?" David asked, biting into his sandwich. "It's fine," Sophie replied. "Psychology is complicated, but interesting. And you and Jenna, have you been together for a long time?" David and Jenna exchanged glances, their smiles light. "6 months," David said. "She keeps me moving." Sophie nodded, her eyes softening. She didn't want to compare Jenna to her mother, but her openness was something she missed in Allison. She decided that she would accept Jenna if she made her father happy. Allison stood in the shelter, handing out blankets to new residents. The work was tiring, but every grateful look gave her strength. She thought back to her life a year ago, her affair with Matt, her dismissal, her divorce. Back then, she had sought refuge in the arms of others, but now she found it in helping others. After her shift, she got into her car and opened her phone. Sophie hadn't responded to her last text, but Allison decided to text again. "Sophie, I know you're angry. I'm not sorry, but I want you to know that I love you. If you need to talk, I'm here." She sent the message, not expecting a response, but feeling relieved. In a session with Dr. Harris, Allison spoke about volunteering and Sophie. She sat on the couch, her voice calm but her eyes pained. "I started working at the shelter," she said. "It helps. I feel like I'm doing something important. But Sophie, I don't know if I'll see you again." Dr. Harris nodded, her voice soft. "You've found meaning, Allison," she said. "That's a big step. How do you feel when you write to Sophie?" Allison swallowed, her fingers tightening on the armrest. "Hope," she admitted, "and fear. I know she might not answer, but I can't stop trying." "That's your strength," Dr. Harris said. "You accept the consequences, but you don't lose faith. How do you see your future?" Allison thought about it. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about David or Sophie, but about herself. She wanted to continue volunteering, find a better job, and live for herself. "I want to be a person I can be proud of," she said, "even if Sophie never forgives." Dr. Harris smiled, her voice firm. "You're already on that path," she said. "Continue." Allison nodded, signing up for the next session. She didn't know if Sophie would respond, but she was willing to wait. She had accepted her mistakes, their consequences, and was now learning to live with them. At home, Allison sat in the living room, looking at an old family photo of her, David, and Sophie at the lake. She no longer cried when she looked at it, but she felt a little sad. She put the photo in a drawer, leaving the shelf empty. It was her way of letting go of the past. Her phone buzzed, a text from Sophie. Got your text. Not ready to talk yet, but thank you. Allison froze, her eyes filling with tears. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. She smiled, feeling a small spark of hope. She didn't know when Sophie would be ready, but she was willing to wait to live her life. Allison stood up, opened her laptop, and started looking for courses on marketing. She decided she would start small, improve her skills, continue volunteering, write to Sophie without asking for a response. Her life was far from perfect, but for the first time she felt like she had a future. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.